This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. So if you've been around this podcast for a long time, you will recall that in 2013, one Brad Rotter, who happened to be the very first investor with Richard Dennis, came on this podcast and said, buy Bitcoin. I did not listen. I'm sure a lot of people did not listen. Brad was right. Now, of course, over the years, Brad and I will exchange emails, and he's been on this show many times. He recommended today's guest, Robert Breedlove. Robert is an interesting guy. He's got a book out, Thank God for Bitcoin, the Creation, Corruption, and Redemption of Money. This is one of those give and take conversations. I definitely challenged Robert, and he definitely swayed me on some issues where some other very smart people had laid down the gauntlet on the negative side of Bitcoin. So I give Robert all the credit for being a very sound and practical voice on the subject of Bitcoin. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with investor, Bitcoin venture capitalist, Bitcoin prophet, Robert Breedlove. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Brad is probably the first person to bring up Bitcoin on this podcast. I think in 2013, he came on here and said, everyone buy it. It's the best investment there will ever be. You're stupid if you don't buy it. I'm paraphrasing, but something to that effect. So I do give him lots of props for that early. Maybe you were earlier. I don't know.
No. Unfortunately, I was not. My first foray into Bitcoin was 2014. And I bought some just on the hype, frankly. It wasn't a lot, bought a little bit and then sold it, roughly double my money, thought I was a genius, moved on. I actually didn't get into the Bitcoin rabbit hole, so to speak, until late 2016, early 17. And by the end of 2017, I had 2 active hedge funds in the crypto asset space. And by the end of 2018, which was a bear market, I had essentially decided to put all of my savings into Bitcoin. I just was becoming increasingly bullish the more I studied the asset class. At the end of 2018, I even got my first tattoo, which is a Bitcoin emblem under my right arm, which to me represents skin in the game and what I consider to be probably the biggest innovation we'll see in our lifetimes.
I'm not completely new to Bitcoin by any stretch of the imagination. I've read a lot. In fact, I've got a white paper here in front of me that we'll probably end up discussing a little bit today. Somebody who was once, I think, firmly in the Bitcoin camp and who is not, that being Nassim Taleb, interesting white paper that came out recently. And of course, you've got a book out, Thank God for Bitcoin. So there's many competing views out there. Let's take it from 2021. For me personally, I try to say, well, what is Bitcoin today? And I had a hedge fund manager on this show recently, and he trades it. But we were talking about it not from the standpoint that, well, okay, there's some fundamental truth about it or fundamental use case. He was like, look, it's traded on the CME now. It goes up and down. It's liquid. I'm trading it. And this is how he trades all of his markets. So he doesn't really care about what the underlying market is or does as long as it's liquid. What is your perspective? I don't really have a use case that I personally can use Bitcoin for, but the damn thing is surely liquid. It's surely going up and down. A lot of money has been made. How do you want people to look at it today in 2021?
Answering the question, what is Bitcoin, is about as difficult as answering the question, what is money? Seems like it would be simple or obvious considering we use money and think in money and have a deep reliance on it. But the contrary is quite true. People have no freaking clue what money is for the most part. And through that same lens, we get to say Bitcoin is the most sophisticated and perfected monetary technology that has ever existed. I don't like the word should very much. I'm not going to should someone how they should look at it, but I will say that it can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The reason I think it is so impactful and important is because when you zoom out and view human history as this ongoing game, this battle to try and control violence, the tax base, and ultimately money itself, the state, which is the monopoly on violence, has been monopolizing money since the dawn of time. And we still live under a money monopoly in the form of a central bank today. Bitcoin represents the first monetary technology or social institution that cannot be monopolized and corrupted. It's a man-made invention, we assume. Some people think Satoshi's an alien or whatever, but that notwithstanding, it's a man-made invention that has placed control over the monetary system beyond the control of man, which is really important. And if you study the history of money, you'll realize that that's in fact why gold was a free market selected monetary technology, because it was the one asset that was most invariant to the efforts of man, whether that was monopolization, politicization, confiscation. It was the asset most resistant to our prying ways. As Nick Szabo would say, it's the most trust minimized asset you can own. By holding gold, you had the minimal need to trust anyone else. So trust minimization was maximized. Maybe a tricky way to say that. Bitcoin's just something disruptive to gold. It has an absolutely fixed supply, cannot be inflated. Pure information can't be stopped, can't be interrupted, can be custodied in any information-bearing medium. So it can be custodied in very high security formats at very low cost. Just gives the individual radical optionality. I mean, you can do anything with Bitcoin. You can put $1 billion between your ears and cross any border you want. The other piece is holding a guaranteed fraction of the total supply. Again, gold was an approximation of this, where you could hold a quantity of gold and you knew with reasonable certainty that you would only inflate 2% a year. But Bitcoin gives you absolute certainty, an absolute fraction of the total supply. There's zero unexpected inflation.
Let me hold you there for a second. And I brought up Taleb, and I don't want this to be a conversation where it's me quoting Taleb, you responding, but he does have some great points in this white paper that he put out. He makes the comparison to gold like you do as well, but he points out that gold doesn't require maintenance and it doesn't degrade. There is, and we saw with China in the last couple months, there is a situation where the mining situation of Bitcoin, that's a little bit different. How do you address the skeptics and those that come down on that side of the aisle and say, hold on, it's not a complete fair comparison to gold?
I'd first say that I'm a big Taleb fan, actually. I've read all of his books. I've read Antifragile twice. He's been very influential on my thinking and worldview in general. But I think on this particular point, he has sort of become what he's resisted in a way, which is this intellectual yet idiot archetype, where he is so caught up in the theory of why Bitcoin should be worth zero that he is ignoring the practice or the practicality of Bitcoin operating in the real world. The specific point where he refers to gold not requiring maintenance, it's absurd, actually. You can't have gold that's not securitized. Otherwise, you're going to get robbed. If you think gold doesn't need maintenance, then why did we build Fort Knox? Why do we construct the central bank? What are all these institutions we build up around gold to make it scale? You could say that the metal itself, in a very base sense, does not require electricity or a software engineer to come in and update it periodically. But with that maintenance limitation comes a commensurate functionality limitation. Gold also doesn't plug into APIs. It has no programmability. With Bitcoin, I think you only get all of these features from an ideal money, which if we just, again, zoom out a little bit on what is money, a lot of definitions. One that I think is especially potent is money is simply a technology for expressing economic value across space and time. The ideal money would be an immutable, unbreakable, incorruptible, correct spreadsheet in the sky, basically. That would give you maximum scalability because it'd just be information. You're just moving entries around, which is what central bank debt-based monies are intended to do. But they introduce corruption because you have one central node. Basically, a central bank is one node updating the ledger. They'll often corrupt that ledger in their favor. That's what inflation is. Whereas Bitcoin takes that same model and it just decentralizes it. This model for perfect monetary scarcity that's composed by the game theoretic aspects of market participants. So everyone in a free market will voluntarily hold the asset most resistant to inflation. That's what gold was, and that's what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin has perfected resistance to inflation. The counterargument by Taleb, I mean, not only is it absurd, but it's been repeatedly debunked. I mean, this is 2021. That argument's been debunked for the past 7 years. The maintenance issue for Bitcoin is really a non-issue, so long as you believe that we'll have electricity in any form worldwide. And if we have no form of electricity worldwide, then we have bigger things to worry about than Bitcoin.
If I just allow myself to think about Bitcoin in the abstract, and if I think about what happened last summer of 2020 in America, we have a COVID crisis still ongoing, a COVID crisis, everything gets locked down, and the United States government, other governments could not do this, could not pull this trick off, just gives people something that represents money, shows up in their account. How that could not be alarming for people. You could all of a sudden tell a couple that's not working, they have kids, hey, here's essentially $100,000 plus in benefits that's just going to show up in your account, and you don't have to do anything. It just seems like if we're at that point right now where a United States government money tree, that if there's a problem here, have some, how the average person doesn't question that and doesn't worry about that. And we know why they don't. It's because they're selfish. They just don't care. They don't care what's going on as long as they can continue their life as it was going on. So in that sense, I love the fact that Bitcoin exists. It's trying. It's not perfect yet. It might not be where it's going to yet. And maybe it doesn't get there. Maybe something happens. But the idea that there are people like yourself, many other people, who want to push forward the idea that there could be something outside of the purview of government politicians just giving people goodies, how can that not make intellectual people just smile?
First thing I'd say about that is government is handing out quote unquote goodies, but what's actually happening, again, if you understand the monetary system, is people are being robbed. Although it may be their future selves, it's clearly disproportionately disfavorable to the poor among us, not just in the US, but worldwide. So when we're printing dollars, we're exporting a lot of that inflation, which impacts the poor, people living on fixed income, et cetera, much more than it does people holding assets. It does give people a reason to smile and be optimistic. But I think the deeper you get, the more you come to view this as an absolute necessity. We can talk about money, but I think what's even more fundamental to this is the nature of property rights. We know in Western civilization, the basis of a sustainable socioeconomic structure or civilization is property rights, right? That you can go out into the world, infuse your most personal form of property, which is your time, your effort, your energy, your ingenuity, your talents, your skills. You can infuse that with something in the world, planting a garden, building a house, building a business, whatever it is. And that you then have exclusive and exhaustive rights to the fruits of your labor. That is what allows us to be more productive, operating interdependently, that we all have these property rights and we can trade them among one another. And that's what prevents us from being violent and coercive towards one another. This is what Bastiat said a long time ago, that if goods and services don't cross borders, soldiers will. We need to trade to create wealth, to prevent, really to incentivize cooperation and disincentivize conflict. But the problem in all of this is that property has never been perfected. Property has always been violable, and that the state retained the power to violate your property rights when necessary, which is either a non-consensual tax bill. You have no say in that negotiation. The IRS chooses a rate, sends you a bill, end of story. Pay it or go to jail. Inflation is a violation of private property rights. Conscription is a violation of private property rights. Jury duty, eminent domain. The monopoly on violence feeds on violations of property rights of people. That's because we always needed this enforcer to preserve property rights in the real world. So now this thing is just self-destructed cyclically over and over again. We've seen it repeatedly. The more property rights get violated, the more of a precursor to the fall of that civilization it becomes. And with Bitcoin, we've created something fundamentally new, which is this purely apolitical property right, independent of the state monopoly on violence. We have, for the first time in history, a form of property, it's a monetary technology, fortunately, which is the most important form of property. Again, that cannot be inflated, confiscated, stopped, and it perfects individual property rights and money. The power that takes away from the state and puts back into the hands of people is difficult to overstate.
Let me keep it at property rights for a moment and use a topical example, and specifically physical real estate in America. I noticed right now the CDC, which last I checked, doesn't have anything to do with the real estate in America. But the CDC has put an eviction moratorium on homeowners, landowners.
Another violation of property rights.
Yeah. I'll let you roll with that in a sec. You got a tenant who hasn't paid for a year, and now they're saying, okay, you can't kick them out. Now, of course, you got to keep paying the bank. And the bank is, of course, in cahoots with the government. A vicious circular type situation. I guess the part for me where you really start to hope and pray, and Bitcoin does ultimately keep succeeding, is because, look, when that can happen, when they can tell you that you no longer own your physical real estate in America, what else do you got? I mean, you got to look around. You got to say, well, hold on. What do I have? What can I control? Isn't that the real issue? What can I truly control?
That's right. That's the nature of property. Again, it's that relationship between asset and owner. If that relationship can be compromised or violated, then it's not yours, technically. It's whoever has the power to violate the relationship that owns the property. When it comes to real estate, that's the most basic, obvious asset there is. The government, again, is the monopoly on violence that's preserving peace within the local territory so that we can have recourse to rule of law and a court system so that we don't have to be violent towards one another. As they become increasingly insolvent, which the government, just record high levels of debt to GDP, diminishing effects of each round of quantitative easing, increasingly exotic monetary policy tools coming out of the central bank, buying corporate debt, et cetera, et cetera. This model of perpetual confiscation via inflation, taxation, et cetera, is just coming to an end. As things get desperate, there is one asset that is impossible to conceal, and that is real estate. Now, people in the US, we have this huge faith in real estate, especially commercial real estate, because it's been the best performing asset class for the past 50 years. It's yield generating, it's great collateral, it's appreciated at really high rates, double-digit rates, I think average for the past 50 years, which, by the way, I would attribute a lot of that to the fact that we went off the gold standard 50 years ago. Real estate was an asset that remained scarce while the currency unit was diminished year over year. That leads to a nominal increase in real estate prices. And I think this long bull market in real estate will really just come to an end once government overreach really needs to escalate and they really need to shore up their revenues. They're going to come after the real estate. Property taxes, capital gains, they're already back on the table, wealth taxes, all of these things will be targeted at high net worth individuals and real estate assets. I think it's a very dangerous place to be for what's ahead, because I do believe this is the dissolution of the nation state model. And again, there's a great book on this called The Sovereign Individual, written in 1997, that predicted a lot of things that we've seen come to pass, including social media, including Bitcoin, including this global pandemic, this very interestingly state-engineered coordinated response to the pandemic, which I think has done more harm than the virus itself. All of these things were predicted 25 years ago. I think we're living through very historic times. Call it the separation of money and state, call it the dawn of the digital age, call it the downfall of the nation state, whatever you want to call it. I think this is an era that promises to be as transformational as the shift from the agricultural age into the industrial age.
Let me take it to a word that you brought up, and this perhaps is a foundational issue to think about. You brought this word up actually multiple times so far, the word violence. I'll give a little bit of a story and I'll let you comment. I remember in 1999, I spent like 10 days in San Francisco, first time there. I thought it was wonderful. I walked everywhere. Just absolutely amazing. Had such a nice time. Then I didn't go back for a long time. In 2013, I ended up moving to Asia, spending most of my time in Saigon. It's an amazingly peaceful place. In all this time, I've not seen any violence. Zero. None. No violence. Back in 2016, 2017, I took a friend from Vietnam. We went to the States. Her and I were in San Francisco. We went to a Vietnamese restaurant in the heart of San Francisco. We were going to walk back towards the waterfront. I walked out of that restaurant, and in front of me, within 2 meters, there was a bunch of gals doing some tricks, IV drug use. Someone defecating. I was shocked thinking back to my 1999 experience. She didn't recognize what was going on, but as a guy, I immediately knew, wow, okay, I can't fight whatever situation I'm in. I just need to get out, and quickly got like an Uber and got back away. Roll forward 4 or 5 years, violence seems to be America's thing, internal violence. This, to me, if one has the ability to avoid what is happening with American real estate, if one has the ability to have money outside of the system, and I'm not saying I do yet. I have not jumped in both feet with Bitcoin by any stretch of the imagination, but I love the philosophical direction. Avoiding violence seems to be the base issue for me. That's what I want. I do not want to be around violent people at all. I just do not want it. Look, I'm a big guy. I'm 6 foot. I'm 195 pounds. I can take care of myself. I don't want to be around violent people.
Yeah, nobody does.
Yeah.
Agreed completely that I don't think anyone wants to deal with violence, right? It always comes out of quote unquote necessity or fear or scarcity of some kind that people would even act violently. I guess you could wrap in crimes of passion to that too. But, I don't think there's anyone that wants to live amid conditions of violence. That is the purpose of the state. You have to give that power to someone such that no one else will abuse it. If someone breaks in your house, there needs to be someone to call. You can resolve that issue. And I just published a piece actually about this, a series I'm calling Sovereignism, which is talking about this mode of socioeconomic organization that Bitcoin enables post-statism. So we've always needed to mobilize this monopoly on violence to organize our economic affairs. But with Bitcoin, it enables us to do something fundamentally different because it's a property right, again, independent of that monopoly. And it also decreases the return on investment to violent activities. And this is at every scale. If you've properly custodied your Bitcoin in a multi-signature wallet or geographic distributed custody schema, whatever it is, it cannot really be stolen. It's theft proof, effectively.
No one knows you have it either.
No one knows you have it. You can have it in multiple places. There's any number of creative ways to custody it. Disincentivizes anyone from wielding violence over you because there's no carrot at the end of the stick. There's a big cost and a big risk to trying to perpetrate violence or coercion on someone. And if there's no reward at the end of it, then clearly that's an uneconomic enterprise and less people will engage in it. Whereas when it comes to gold or cash under your mattress, someone can break in against your will and take it. They don't need your consent. And it's not perfect, by the way. I'm not saying that Bitcoin's some type of panacea. You can still have extortion. You still have ransom, all of these things that people have done historically. It certainly does change the economics of violence, which is, again, the core thesis of that book, The Sovereign Individual. And I think it does it in a way that causes us to, as a species, this is a very big deal. Like, over the generations, people are now incentivized to adopt longer term, more cooperative trading relationships to generate wealth versus rent seeking or coercion or violence or theft. The entire business model of the nation state is premised on. I know this is not a fun topic for a lot of people, but by definition, a non-consensual exchange of value is theft. So that includes, again, your non-consensual tax bill, inflation, eminent domain, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things that feed revenues into the nation state model are theft. Theft-proof capital in Bitcoin is something that is extremely valuable.
Let me keep it at you for just a second. You give some background, you lay out how early you got involved. The average listener doesn't know your net worth, but they know you've done okay. You've taken a good ride with Bitcoin. So why, in this day and age where minimizing the target area, why have you decided to put yourself out there and speak so clearly and speak about these issues? Because you do become a target.
I think it'd be pretty fruitless to try to target me. The security, again, if you do your security properly with Bitcoin, there's just nothing to be had, nothing to be gained. As far as why I'm outspoken about it, I guess I've labeled myself as a freedom maximalist, which is sort of part libertarian, part anarchist, part Bitcoiner, I guess you'd say. You have to have Bitcoin as a component of that. You have to have free market money if you truly value freedom.
You know the system is broken, and Bitcoin might not be perfect, but at least it gives you a chance outside the system.
Well, it's a fundamentally new system. It's very easy to view like, oh, there's this giant monolithic system that exists today. It's threatening me in one way or another. I need to live outside of it. What's actually happening is there's one system dying and another system emerging. At what point do you leave the sinking ship and board the seaworthy vessel? That's what I would argue is happening in the world. And insofar as my outspokenness, I just think this is the next leg up for civilization, frankly. We figured out property rights. And a lot of this is rooted in Judeo-Christian mythology, frankly. Christ taught us the sovereignty of the individual is higher than the sovereignty of the state, told us to speak the truth. This leads to a lot of things, one of which was the Protestant Reformation. Protestant work ethic becomes the ethos that underpins capitalism, which is built on property rights. Again, honoring the individual's work effort and ethic above the state's right to the fruits of those labor. This got us to where we are today. We are the most wealthy strata of human civilization there has ever been. So even with this marginalized statist form of capitalism, we have taken ourselves to radically new heights. This system has taken the spirit of capitalism and it has perfected its implementation. We've gone from relatively sound property rights, at least in the US. They're decreasingly sound by the day for all the reasons we've outlined earlier. And we've implemented a system that perfects the property, the inviolability of the property. So it's just something that no one can do anything about. And it's extremely exciting. I just think that it really takes us to the next level. And I guess looking through the lens of my own legacy, I just want to be a part of that, to say that I tried to help contribute towards this advancement of civility in the world versus acting out of fear or trying to run away from it or not tell the truth or hide. That just doesn't feel as genuine to me.
I'm sure you're well aware, but places like China and Vietnam, purchasing real estate in the last several decades has become a pretty big deal, and people have gotten quite wealthy from it. I have explained to some Vietnamese the American system of real estate, which for people on the outside looking in, they just imagine these things about America. that are not true. I explained the last piece of property that I owned in the States, and I explained the amount of taxation that I was paying in Fairfax County, Virginia, right outside DC. And then I explained that if I didn't pay it, what would happen? And the look on their face was just aghast. They said, hold on. You pay the 7 figures plus for the property. You put all your money into it. You own it. But then if you don't pay this very high yearly tax, they take it away from you and don't give you anything. And I think that's something people around the world don't understand about America. There's such good propaganda about how we supposedly do things. But when you get under the covers, and when you're an American, and when you're under the covers and you understand, it's really interesting.
You're right. First of all, the property tax, whatever the percentage, if you don't pay it, that's it. They confiscate the property, liquidate it, you're done. It's crazy. It seems like the more economically just system would be to just take an equity stake in the property, right? Like, oh, you didn't pay your 2% tax. We now own 2% of the property, and just let it roll year over year, maybe add some penalty or interest or whatever. It's just a testament to who you're dealing with, right? Anytime you're trying to negotiate with a monopolist, you're fucked. They have no incentive to care about your preferences. They're the only player in town. For those reasons, they move slow, they do what they want, they don't innovate. I would argue too that it almost corrupts at an individual level. If you've ever dealt with someone in a bureaucracy or any type of monopolistic institution, the personalities you deal with aren't very human almost. There's no incentive to care, so they don't care. And after decades of not caring, they just become not people.
Look, having grown up in the DC area, they care about one thing. They care about the money that's going to get transferred to their account every month. They care about whatever their health benefits are, which is more money. They care about their vacation pay, which is more money. It's all about rigging the system to benefit themselves, regardless of what happens to the overall system. They just don't give a shit. Let me take it to a criticism of Bitcoin. I guess this would be one from me. Of course, look, anybody with a pulse, if you're halfway alive, you're saying, oh gosh, why didn't I not put 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million in Bitcoin in 2013. I mean, everyone says that because everyone knows what the math is, right? However, today in 2021, beyond the speculative part of it, it doesn't really operate as a currency, does it? It's very difficult to use. The acceptance is not there yet. On the speculative side, making money, I mean, of course, it's a fantastic asset. Do you consider it a currency at this moment?
The cause of most arguments is definitions. If we define 2 definitions, I'll go for currency. One would be the monopolized monetary instrument the state forces you to use via legal tender and other laws. So you could say currency is the monetary domain of government. Under that definition, Bitcoin can clearly never be a currency because it can never be monopolized or controlled by any government or anyone whatsoever. That is what it's designed to do, is to be a fixed, unbreakable rule set that nobody can change. A secondary definition of currency I would give is that money which flows. That's what currency means. Current currency is something that flows through an economy. It's used as a medium of exchange. And through that lens, I think Bitcoin is following the same evolutionary path that gold did. And we know this from studying Austrian economics, that gold initially was just valued for its collectible/ornamental purposes. People just thought it was pretty and they held on to it, made jewelry out of it, things like this. But what this created in the marketplace was a reservation demand for gold. People were collecting this thing, so they're taking it off the market. And again, because its supply was very inflexible, this put a lot of upward pressure on its purchasing power, or price, if you want to use that term for money. And over time, gold eventually has accrued enough value, storing enough value. It's succeeded sufficiently as a store of value, which is one of the first functions of money, that people start to use it in trade more broadly. So they start to actually denominate transactions in it. That's when it starts to flow. That's when gold becomes a currency. And then eventually, when it's widely accepted enough as a medium of exchange or as a currency, that people actually start to think in it and speak in it and negotiate in it. And that's when money evolves into its third function, which is a unit of account. The incentives right now related to Bitcoin, call it a $700 billion asset today. It's competing for, at the bare minimum, gold's market cap, which is $10 trillion. You're talking about a 14x upside just to get to gold's market cap. More broadly, I think I and many other Bitcoiners would argue Bitcoin is competing to be money, which is around 100 trillion. This is pre-COVID numbers. We call it $100 trillion of global M2, roughly, probably closer to 125 post-COVID. And then even more broadly, I and other Bitcoiners would argue that Bitcoin is really competing for the store of value marketplace. Because fiat currency is printed ad infinitum, smart people, smart money does not store their wealth in dollars. You store it in something that's inflation resistant: real estate, gold, oil, art, equities, et cetera, et cetera. That total market space for store of value is in the neighborhood of $200 to $250 trillion. So you have a $0.7 trillion asset, $0.7 trillion asset, competing to be at the very low range, a $10 trillion asset, at the very high range, a $250 trillion asset. Why in the world do I care if I can buy coffee with it? I talked to Saylor again last week. He makes this great point. He goes, no one complains that you couldn't buy coffee with your Facebook stock 10 years ago or your Google stock. This is something, it's a digital network competing for such a large addressable market that the incentive is to hold. The currency function is just a secondary. Once this thing does get to 10, 20, 30, $50 trillion, that draws in more talent, more tech, more attention, that people build out these applications to make it circulate better. All that said, so clearly I'm making the point that Bitcoin is much more apt as a store of value at this stage of its evolution. I do use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. With the vendors and Bitcoiners that I work with, we transact on the Lightning Network every day. It's the simplest thing in the world. Put Bitcoin on a Lightning wallet, just a little bit, just enough to spend and do some day-to-day transactions. It's as easy or easier than PayPal or anything else. You scan an invoice number and you hit pay. Boom, it's gone. It's done. And for audience members that may not know, the Lightning Network is just second layer protocol built on Bitcoin. It just makes it more transactional. It makes some trade-offs, so you're not getting the same level of security assurances. You're trusting smart contracts versus Bitcoin's base chain. However, what you trade off in security, you pick up in transaction throughput. And in theory, at least, Lightning Network's still early. It works, but the network is sufficiently dense. The transactions per second, I think, approach infinity. So you're talking about a system for global instant final settlement, something that no technology on earth could do before that. There is no PayPal, no Venmo, et cetera, for gold, for physical gold. You can't have final settlement in the digital space before Bitcoin. All that said, I think that Bitcoin very easily becomes currency under that second definition, and that the more value it accretes, the easier it will become. It will naturally become a medium of exchange. But under that first definition of government control, clearly that's just never possible.
Since you did such an interesting, sharp rebuttal of the one Taleb comment that I put out there, I want to read one more from that white paper that he did. Again, I respect the hell out of him. He's a really smart guy. All of his books tremendously influential on me. He's got a comment in here that he calls it comment number 4, law versus regulations versus rules. And he says, and you've brought this up multiple times today, talking about libertarianism. He says, libertarianism is about the rule of law in place of the rule of regulation. It is not about the rule of rules. And he's essentially saying, the rule of rules, mechanistic, automated rules with irreversible outcomes, Bitcoin. How do you respond to that?
I don't understand the comment.
He's saying that he wants to have, and he reaches to Napoleonic law, that there is some way to get around things. There is some way that things can be solved. It's not inflexible. He makes the comment here. He says, libertarianism is not about total distrust. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. He'd probably kill me. I'm paraphrasing wrong. But he's essentially saying, like, look, Bitcoin is, you can't get around it. It's mechanistic. It's automated. It's irreversible. We're human. We need to have some ability to work with this system. And with Bitcoin, we can't.
Well, a couple of things I'd say on that. One, the only thing immutable about Bitcoin, first of all, you can do whatever you want on Bitcoin, by the way. You can go run your node right now and choose whatever rules you want. It doesn't matter. You can make 800 million Bitcoin on your node. You choose whatever rule set you want. And this is true for every individual node operator. The thing is that holds Bitcoin together and prevents everyone from just playing by their own rules is the social consensus of 21 million Bitcoin. No reversing transactions, no counterfeiting, no inflating, no confiscating. That is a rule set that is voluntarily adopted by every node operator because it is in their best personal interest. So to say that we have some type of, he's making it sound like Bitcoin imposes rules or something, like that's not the case. It's like it's freely selected, it's freely chosen. The second piece would be that Bitcoin has this interesting governance asymmetry in that it resists the social layer that I just described. It is resistant to unfavorable changes to the rule set. How could you encourage someone to go against their own self-interest? Say, hey, let's fork Bitcoin and make 42 million. You're going to be like, why would I inflate myself? Why would I dilute myself? By the way, even if you do campaign successfully, however you do it, the optimal strategy for the holder is to still just hold. Because when you fork the network, you get allocated 1-for-1, Bitcoin Cash for Bitcoin, for instance. The network has this asymmetric governance dynamic where it resists unfavorable changes, but it is still open to favorable changes. And changes are being implemented on the network all the time. We've got Schnorr signatures and Taproot this year. We had segregated witness back in 2017. There's upgrades happening to the network all the time, so long as they benefit all network participants. There has to be a strong consensus around it. And there's a number of checks and balances that cause Bitcoin to move slow on that regard. It doesn't upgrade or add features quickly, but I would argue that's a strength. You want your immutable base layer. You want it to be a rock solid foundation. It doesn't need to have a bunch of bells and whistles. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be a block every 10 minutes and a hard cap of 21 million. And that's what Bitcoin optimizes for. And then I would lastly say that his assessment of libertarianism is wrong. Libertarianism is rooted in natural law. I have my own reservations about this, the Rothbardian interpretation of natural law, but he argues that it is an immutable reality, that all human beings have reason. Therefore, the best way to afford ourselves is from that reason and to build systems that are reasonable, that there is an immutable foundation to natural law, which underpins the libertarian philosophy. So I'm not sure what Taleb's even saying about you need bendable rules or more trust. It's not even relevant to the philosophical angle or to the technological aspect of Bitcoin.
One last issue I want to bring up, and we've kind of talked about this throughout. We have one current system. Let's just use America as an example. We have a monetary system. We have a government system. And then we have this new system, as you described, we're talking about with Bitcoin. I'll let you run with where I'm about to go, but I've caught recently, I think it's BlackRock, is going around America. And I guess if you've got an unlimited sized hedge fund, this is a great idea. But they're going around America and they're buying up real estate, residential real estate. They're paying a big premium. Now, I'm sure the people that are offloading the real estate, like, wow, this is great. This hedge fund's paying me way more than market value. However, if one is not looking down the road, hold on, are we facing a situation in the future where very large hedge funds own a significant amount of residential real estate in America, something very new? They keep it at a higher price. The average person, the young people, can therefore no longer be able to buy it. Well, what does that leave them with? Well, they're going to be renters forever. And of course, the hedge funds are not going to compete against themselves. So the prices will just fix at a high point. They can control their taxes, et cetera, probably negotiate lower taxes. And then the average American is just a renter. I mean, this gets back to the big philosophical issue that I hope and I pray that things like Bitcoin and other perhaps cryptocurrencies can solve, because if the state in cahoots with very large funds operate this way, what does the average person do? The average person who wants to have some freedom, wants to have a life they can control. I mean, there's only so many ways around a scenario where a BlackRock is buying up residential real estate, and cryptocurrency, for its faults that we've talked about, some of them for its faults. I mean, gosh, you've really got to look at the positives too. There is a lot going on these days.
I don't see how it's possible to answer your question without saying buy Bitcoin. You want to talk about having freedom and optionality independent of the political and state apparatus. There's only one asset in the world that gives you that independence. I mean, maybe at the margins, you could argue buying a lot of physical gold, putting it in your walls or your backyard or whatever. But from a very practical standpoint, Bitcoin is many orders of magnitude more usable and portable and securable than gold. I have a hard time seeing why anyone would do that. And I would also say that I think what's happening there is the hedge funds, they're just benefiting directly from the fiat currency spigot. So they're awash in all this artificial liquidity post monetary expansion in this COVID world we're in now. And they're just trying to put the dollars in something that won't diminish, something that fits their investment mandates. And real estate tends to be something that's pretty well within that sense-making structure. But all of this is extremely bad for the marketplace. We're veering away from supply and demand fundamentals, and we are creating an environment where prices are more completely premised on policy than they are supply and demand. So this is going to have devastating downstream consequences. The obvious one is homelessness. There is a very tight correlation between expansion of the money supply, the S&P 500, how many hours it takes to work at the average hourly wage rate to acquire one share in the S&P 500. So this has gone over the past 50 years. I might be off on the numbers here, but I'm not off on the magnitude. I think it's gone from 15 to 120 plus hours of work at the average hourly wage rate to buy one share of the S&P 500. So this speaks directly to the disparity of wealth that expanding fiat currency creates. And the last one is homelessness. The homeless population absolutely explodes and moves in a tight correlation with expansion of the money supply, because we're just dispossessing those at the bottom of the economic hierarchy more and more. If you're not scared by all of this, you haven't studied history. The government feeds on property violations. And when it goes broke, it's got this whole history of bad decisions, all these inefficient bureaucratic models up and running. What's the old saying that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government solution? We have all these entitlements and everything built into this thing. It never faces creative destruction through capitalism. There's never a culling back of the government. It just feeds on property and gets more and more top heavy until some type of social revolt or hyperinflation occurs. They go hand in hand. The fact that you're seeing government wage war on property and you're seeing large institutions like BlackRock now just buying real estate directly, further centralizing control over the most important asset, at least over the past 50 years, which is real estate. I don't know how you can't be really scared. And it doesn't matter if, even if you were the chairman of the board of BlackRock and you own a huge stake, this whole dynamic still destroys economic activity. So you're talking about crushing the division of labor, crushing wealth creation, and at the same time, feeding the appetite for social revolt. People are just fed up. This whole experiment with fiat currency is just going to fail right before our eyes over the next 15 years. And these are all early warning signs. You see these institutions digging their heels in and preparing for what Paul Tudor Jones called the great monetary inflation, and what I would call is the nation state dissolution. I think we'll see some things you would never imagine seeing for the next 15 or 20 years. I've got a public projection that the US dollar will go into hyperinflation by the year 2035. And I stand by that.
We know, everyone knows, if they're being honest with themselves, when you look at the amount of hypocrisy in political leaders, the hypocrisy in media, the outright just lying, the propaganda on all issues, on all fronts, anyone that feels safe and comforted in that is a low IQ imbecile. I mean, there is no way somebody with an intellect, somebody that can reason and think, there is no way they can feel comfortable in the current system. And by no means do I think Bitcoin is perfect yet, or there is some perfect situation. But damn, we should all be alarmed. And I think that's what Bitcoin gives people, is if you are alarmed and you are awake, at least it's a way, no guarantee, a way out of that storm that I agree with you is coming.
One thing we do know about fiat currency is that it is a lie. It's fraudulent. For all the reasons we've laid out today, it's a mechanism for violating private property. So it's no surprise to me that the entire world becomes engulfed in lies when the money is a lie. Say what you will about Bitcoin, but it is honest. It is honest money. What you see is what you get. There are no hidden schemes. It's purely open source technology. It's 100% inspectable, and it's freely chosen. I think it's a great answer to, if not the only answer, to the storm that's coming.
I could pick your mind for hours. We'll do a really long one, perhaps. I would love to go down the rabbit hole with you. The book, Thank God for Bitcoin, The Creation, Corruption, and Redemption of Money. Robert, where would you like to send people? Where can they go check you out?
Yeah, the book is available on Amazon. I encourage anyone who's interested in learning about a brief history of money, its implications on morality. It's told through a Judeo-Christian framework, but it's not a religious book at all, really. And it's a very, very simple read. Maybe it takes you 2 or 3 hours to read it. And we really wrote it to be accessible. So that's available on Amazon and everywhere else. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Breedlove22, BREEDLOVE22. I post links to my YouTube channel and my Substack page there, where I post all my writing. My DMs are open. Happy to answer any questions.
Robert, thank you for taking some time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.